Greetings everyone, Prophet here. Today I'm going to be doing a video that goes over the perks of the predator classes in Predator Hunting Grounds. Many of these perks are very good, but there are a lot of them which maybe seem better than they are, or some that you don't really know whether you should choose them or not. So I'm going to start from the top to the bottom. Some perks I will kind of conglomerate together as they're very similar or do the same thing, but one maybe does it better. So without further ado, let's just get into this. So Branch Master is one of those perks that most Predator players probably haven't even ever slotted, because it's a 1-point perk that you get at the very start of the game. But anyone who's played this game for a long enough time as Predator and has faced really good fire teams will know that this is a really pointless perk, because whilst it makes using the trees slightly more viable, it still doesn't take away from the fact that trees in this game just are not worth using. You might be able to get one plasma blast off in a tree before you have to relocate, but they're just not worth using as a main source or something to focus your entire build around. So it's just not useful in my opinion. Clotted is a perk that basically is only useful at very, very high level play, and since it's such high level play, it's basically not worth taking, because unless you are specifically going against a pre-made fire team that you know for a fact are very good and will chase you down, this perk is probably not going to be any use, because the vast majority of public lobby games, people don't chase you down and they're certainly not looking for the blood trails. So it's a good perk, but it's just never going to get used unless you're in a private game with a really good team. Energy Cell is one of those perks which a lot of people very early on like to use in combination with things like Lightbender and Modified Reserve to make these quote-unquote infinite invisibility builds, or infinite heat vision, whatever you want to call it. Whilst this perk isn't terrible and it does exactly what it says on the tin, if you really want more energy, Lightbender or Modified Reserves are way better, in my opinion, alternatives to this one. Impenetrable, the big perk itself. This is a perk which is, I mean, pretty much everyone's going to say this is one of the best perks in the game. Most people run it, and it's one of those things that's basically just a baseline perk in every build, unless maybe you're playing Berserker because of the low perk points. However, I mean, there's not really much to be said about this. It's useful on near enough every class, but it's definitely not something you can't live without. I think that's all I'm going to really say about Impenetrable. It makes you take about 10% less damage from bullets, so it doesn't affect grenades, grenade launchers, or the grenade launcher attachment on the hammerhead rifle, nothing like that. It just affects bullets, which is the vast majority of this game anyway. That being said, it's not a necessity at all. So if you really, I mean, early game you're going to want to use this if you're new and inexperienced, but generally speaking, this perk, like I said, very good. I use it in most of my builds just because it's baseline damage reduction. That's always going to be useful, but don't be afraid to take this off. It's not a mainstay perk by any means. If you really don't need to have this perk, it's just a nice perk to have. Large Pouch. This is a perk that I pretty much always run because I can pretty much always guarantee that it's useful. And that's one of the important things to think about when you're using perks, is am I actually going to get a use out of this perk every game or near enough every game? If you have a perk on, like say Lightbender, which reduces your cloak consumption, but you for some reason never use cloak in the entire game, then having this perk is pointless. So it's the same thing. If you have Large Pouch on but you never use the third medic kit, or you don't use all your gear, you rarely use gear, then it's not really worth it. If you find yourself using pigs way more, you find yourself not using the gear very often, then Large Pouch is pointless to have. It doesn't mean anything unless you use all your gear and all your med kits. Otherwise it's just a pointless slot to take up. Now, Large Pouch, however, does allow you to be a lot more aggressive, because you can basically use a free healing kit at any point that anyone without this perk wouldn't have. And you have free medkits and balls, it can really make the Predator incredibly hard to finish off. Lightbender. This is a perk that I do like, but I'm going to couple this in with Modified Reserves, so we'll talk about both of these. I think, from my own personal testing, these are near enough the exact same perk, but I would say Modified Reserves probably slightly better, just because if you're using the shoulder-mounted plasma caster, you're also getting that energy back quicker, which means you're less likely to energy overload. Lightbender is great, but personally, I'm very rarely in a situation where I wish that my cloak had used less energy, and it takes 2 seconds, especially with like the Alder or the Scout, to just turn off the cloak and get your energy back. So I don't think this is worth having, but it's not terrible. I think Modified Reserves and Lightbender are basically the same thing. And energy is definitely important at high level play with the shoulder mounted caster, so I would recommend taking one of these, but my personal preference is that Modified Reserve basically does what Lightbender does, plus a little bit more. Medic. This is a perk I really like, and this is where I wish that there was a 4th slot for perks, just so that you could have some of these little perks that don't really mean much, like for instance Clotted or Branchmaster, Medic, hell even like Resourceful, because these perks, they're not worth taking over something like the main big perks of the game, but they're nice to have. If you have Large Pulse and Medic, you have free medkits you can use very quickly and just keep the pressure on. But ultimately, Medic isn't really worth taking, just because it will take up one of these slots. Is it worth having Medic over Large Pouch? Is it worth having Medic over Impenetrable? Is it worth having it over Fearless, Downrange? No. Is it still a very nice, good perk that does what it says on the tin? Yes. But it's just not worth having over the others. There's no need to talk about Resourceful, but I will say this is a terrible perk. I used this whilst leveling up just because I wanted every little inch of extra XP that I could get. And this was honestly, I couldn't notice the difference between having this on and having it off. I think it genuinely changes XP from killing, say, a random NPC from 10 XP to 11. Now it says it increases it from all sources, but this increase, it must honestly be like a 2% increase or something. I have not once used this perk and gone, wow, I'm blown away by the amount of XP I've gained. It's not really even worth taking if you're trying to level up, but if you can still win games, I mean, every little bit of XP helps and it's going to add up. But generally this perk definitely needs to be improved, because it just has really poor increase to your actual overall XP. It's really not great. Now, Spectral Awareness is a perk which is one of the few perks in the game which apparently just doesn't work. This isn't needed anyway. You can always target isolate at the start of the game. Majority of the time you'll see where they are. You always spawn opposite where the fire team are on the map anyway. And there's only so many bases they're going to be going to. You don't really need sound indicators to figure out where people are. And like I said, it doesn't work anyway. So it's just not worth having. Dithered Lens is a good perk. However, at higher level, it kind of becomes pointless, because when you're using the shoulder mounted plasma caster, the tactic is to aim it at something in front of you and then either crouch or move forwards, like re-crouch or move forwards, and then shoot. So essentially what this does is make it so that the laser is invisible the entire time it's charging, and then only visible as the plasma caster shot actually goes towards your target. That way they have no idea they're being aimed at until they've already got a projectile coming towards their face. Dithered Lens is a nice perk, and it is actually pretty good. From certain angles it makes the laser pretty much invisible, but again, it's not worth taking over some of the other bigger, more important perks. Fearless. Now, Fearless goes hand in hand with Downrange. These both add a 10% increase to damage, either for melee weapons or ranged weapons. Now, something that is important to note about Fearless is that it only adds 5% damage to the wrist blades, but 10% to every other weapon. For this single reason is why I don't take Fearless, because a lot of the higher level, more optimal weapons in the game allow you to instantly use the wrist blade, for example the handheld, or the net gun, or the shoulder caster. You can instantly go into the wrist blades. Hell, even if you're using the combi stick, you're using a throw to hit someone, which is classed as extra damage in downrange, that does affect that, followed up by wrist blade attacks. So the majority of the time when you're playing at a higher level, you're using a lot of wrist blades. Now, that's not to discount the new katana and the Elder Sword, especially the Elder Sword being a very good weapon. With Fearless it becomes even better, but generally speaking I think that because the way that high level Predator plays, which is a very heavily focused ranged build, I think it's much more advantageous to not only save a point by having downrange, as it's 1 point less than Fearless, but also increasing the damage of your ranged weapons, which is the majority of your damage in the game anyway. You're always shooting people with plasma caster shots from a distance. You're always using the handheld, you're throwing the combi stick, you're doing all these things that cause lots of range damage, and generally melee is a finishing move. You jump in to finish them off. Now if you shot someone twice with the plasma caster and they're still somehow alive, it doesn't matter if you're using a combi stick or a foam sword, they're probably on like 20 health, they're gonna die in 1 or 2 hits anyway of any melee weapon. So I don't think it's worth having 10%, because that 10% doesn't actually change the amount of hits it takes to down the person. So Fearless is only really useful, in my opinion, if you're actually running a very heavy melee orientated build. But this is where it comes into fact, and this is probably the biggest talking point, is that generally speaking, melee is not worth it over ranged. Melee is used to finish off opponents, to confuse opponents, maybe do some hit and run, and it's only really useful against bad players. But having a perk that specifically focuses around dealing with bad players who can't parry is a little bit backwards in my opinion, when you could have a ranged buff which works against good players and bad players. See, if you have really good parry players who can parry every melee weapon pretty well, and you have a fire team backing them up by shooting you, it doesn't matter how much, it doesn't matter if Fearless increases your melee damage by 50%, because you're going to get parried and then you're going to get shot in the face and second winded or near enough second winded, giving them more time to do the objectives and so on. Whereas down range, if you do a ton of range damage and you go in to finish them and then, oh crap, they parried me, now I'm taking a bunch of damage, you can be like, well, it's fine because I can still use the ranged weapons I have, and they're also being buffed by downrange. But if the same thing happens with Fearless, you'll now got a perk, like I said, that isn't doing anything, because you can't use the melee damage increase from it, because you can't use melee against this fire team. Now you can use melee against any fire team, no matter how good or bad they are at parrying, but it doesn't change the fact that you can't parry a plasma caster blast to the face, a handheld to the face, a combi stick to the face, even a smart dish to the face. And therefore these options are just better, and you take less damage. If you jump into an engagement and take, say, 50 rounds to the body, and then let's say in another example you are plasma casting someone from a distance and you also take 50 rounds to the body, one's a melee engagement, one's a ranged engagement, you will still take less damage even though you took the same amount of rounds in both situations in the ranged plasma caster version, because at a range bullets do less damage. So you are always at an advantage by being at a range as the Predator than being in melee, which is why melee should only be used to finish people off, in my opinion. So I managed to miss these out, so this has just been edited in post, but I needed to talk about these two perks, Coolant Sinks and Long Jump, because these are actually two perks I quite like, or at least people tend to use somewhat often. I think Coolant Sinks is a good perk. It reduces the cooldown on energy overloads. Now in practice this is a good perk, but from my own personal testing and from what generally most people say about this, is it really doesn't make much of a difference. It's not like with this you can just plasma cast all day every day and you're not going to have any problems whatsoever. It literally changes by a few seconds. It's not worth having. It costs a lot of points too. I think a lot of people used to run this back when slamming through the top of buildings was good, and that meant you could just slam more often. But at this point, in this current meta, it's just not worth taking it. It isn't, in my opinion. It's not. And long jump, this is a perk that I personally find is actually really annoying, but it could be useful on Samurai and Berserker, just because they can only leap a certain amount of times, so making those leaps further will obviously help. But the reason why I say this is annoying is because if you have this on Elder or Scout and you want to leap on top of a pole or a roof somewhere or whatever, you end up leaping past it because your leap is now increased by long jump. So it just gets pretty annoying. So for that reason, I don't really like using long jump. But for the heavier, bulkier classes, it's definitely good. But again, it's 4 points, and those heavier, bulkier classes don't have many perk points, so it's really a hindrance to bring this, because it just really damages the other perks that you can bring, which is, I think, the main problem with it. If this was a 2 or 3, a 1, I can't see it being a 1 point perk, but if it was, this would be pretty good to run on pretty much every heavy class. But because it's not, it's really a risk to take this, because it just ruins your perk setup for those heavier classes with less perk points. Height Advantage is the most laughable, pointless, terrible perk that has ever been conceived in this game. Why it cost 5 points? It's the only perk other than Impenetrable that cost 5 points, and Impenetrable is one of the best perks in the game. All it does is reduce your damage. I think it's 25%. It's a pretty high number, but it's only in the trees, which is pointless. I mean, we don't even really need to talk about this because the trees are bad. But let's say for some reason you're running this. Okay, great, you're a tank in the trees, but are you going to sit there in the trees getting shot at just so that you can utilize this perk? Or are you going to go, great, they know where I am, I'm getting shot, I'm going to reposition. I know which option I'm going to choose. If for some reason you want to sit in a tree and get shot while shooting them back and losing the trade ultimately whilst 4 fire team members shoot you on this predetermined path that you're allowed to walk across this branch, then go ahead and take this perk. But this perk is terrible and it should be a 1 point perk. It is dreadful. Why it's a 5 point perk is beyond me. Maybe Ilphonic thought that every Predator was going to use the trees like constantly and this was going to be like some ridiculously good perk, but no one uses the trees. It's a bad perk. Impatient and Hanging On are pretty much the same thing, except Impatient is definitely the better one. This just makes it so that your second wind comes back quicker. I don't really know why you would want the second wind duration to be longer. This is when you go into second wind and the bar goes down. It's already pretty damn long. I don't know why you would waste a perk slot on making this longer. It's just not very good in my opinion. I've heard a lot of people say that Observant is a very good perk. I kind of disagree. As long as you have motion detectors, I don't think this is a good perk. If you go to a fire base and you've killed someone and you're worried someone's going to sneak out whilst mudded up to get reinforcements, you can easily, especially if you have large pouch, you have 5 motion detectors, set them up on every one of the exits and you can get a ping when someone's going to leave the base towards the reinforcements. I don't think it's worth taking this. Again, it's a good perk, but it's not worth taking over some of the better slots. It's just not. Adrenal Boost. Good perk for, say, Samurai, Predator, or Berserker. A bit overkill on something like Scout, and okay on Elder, but again, a little bit overkill, not really needed. It just basically gives any class you put it on like 1 leap more, maybe 2 if you're Scout. It's not amazing, but it's definitely nice to have, especially if you're used to Scout and Elder, when you're playing those clunkier classes, because nothing is more annoying than bunny hopping on the spot whilst you're getting shot at, hoping that you can leap away as this slow berserker or samurai predator. Protection is a perk that I wish I could run. Again, if there was a 4th perk slot, I would run this all the time. But because there isn't, I basically will never run this. So it's just a shame, it's part of the game. I wish we had a 4th perk slot. It just makes your biomass take less damage. If I had this, I would be able to take way more dangerous trades with like recon players and whatnot. But because I don't, whenever you get pinned down by those really good God Squad rifle just shooting you across the map snipers, it becomes incredibly difficult to deal with, because you don't want to lose your biomask. Not because you can't out-trade them or kill them, because you're risking your biomask in doing so. So this is very good. It's also very good for melee orientated builds, because it means that you can, when you're running in there, you're taking less damage and you're not just going to lose your mask after like 3 or 4 melee engagements. Trap is one of those perks I think a lot of people like when they first get it, but this perk is not that great. Simple reason being is that for both the net gun and the bear traps, they last plenty long enough by default for you to capitalize on their effects. You don't need to make them stronger. Net gun is also very subjective, because you might have an absolute god at mashing buttons, or you might have someone who doesn't even know how to get out of the net. Which means this perk can either be amazing or pointless. So it's a good perk in that it does what it says on the tin. It's just not useful because the traps and the net guns are already good. Maybe if they get nerfed in the future, this will be a good perk to have, but currently they're fine as they are. If someone gets trapped, you can easily combi stick them, plasma cast, handheld, jump down melee them, do whatever you want before they can break out. Ascender, pointless perk. Don't know why this is a perk that exists, and why it's such a high level perk as well. As far as I know, this reduces the time it takes to climb up a tree from like 3 seconds to 1 second. But again, there's no real reason to climb up a tree, and also you can just press space when looking at branches from below to jump straight to the branch instead of actually having to climb up the tree. So this perk is pointless. Heated is another one of those perks. It's the vision mode version of Lightbender. I personally just don't think this is that great. I would rather have modified reserves that benefits my whole energy as opposed to just one component of my energy use. And fast hands, it sounds good, especially if you're using like a net gun and then you switch to like katana or elder sword. But I also heard that this perk doesn't actually work. It doesn't actually increase your gear switching speed at all. So that is something you'd have to figure out. I don't use this very often because, again, it's one of those perks that just doesn't really do anything. It's good to have, but it's not like a game changer compared to some of the other perks, which are just a constant bonus. So with all that being said, what perks should you use? What are the best perks? Without a doubt, if you can, you want Impenetrable, Fearless and Downrange, and then the middle one here is pretty much either Large Pouch, Lightbender, Modified Reserves, or Adrenal Boost. Those are pretty much that is pretty much the only real solid meta build you can have. Now, like I said, plenty of these perks are good, but that combination is the best. So, just to go over it again, you want Impenetrable as just basically a baseline, Downrange or Fearless, but I personally recommend Downrange, but it's up to you. And then in the middle, this is the one that you can basically be free with. Choose whatever you want for this one, but if I had to guide you, it would be Large Pouch, Modified Reserves, Lightbender, or Adrenal Boost. Every other perk in the game is pretty much fine, with the exception of some like height advantage, ascender, branch master, spectral awareness, and like fast hands, because apparently it doesn't work. But anything that isn't those I just mentioned, they do what they say on the tin, and you can use them like you would expect to, and you'll be fine. But I'm just generally saying the perks that I'm mentioning to use, they are without a doubt the best perks that give you a constant effect, whether you're fighting a good team, a bad team, a team that you can engage in melee, a team that you can't engage in melee. Because you have to remember that just because you have downrange on doesn't mean that you're not allowed to use melee attacks. It just means that your ranged aspect is doing more damage than your melee. But your melee doesn't need to do as much as your range, because your range is the way you're chipping away at that health. Melee is just the icing on the cake. The last couple hits to down them so that you can move on. Anyway, it's been Prophet. Thanks for watching. Hope this helped. See you later.